Proponents of CL value not just freedom from aggression, but also freedom from the kind of social pressure people can exert. Social pressure they often are able to exert because they or others have engaged in or benefited from aggression. Proponents of CL also value freedom from non-aggressive but unreasonable, perhaps petty or arbitrary social pressure that constrains people's options and their capacity to shape their lives as they like. Think about the ways in which a conservative culture might limit people's options because of gender, or the ways in which workplaces might subject workers to arbitrary petty harassment. Valuing different kinds of freedom emphatically isn't the same as approving the same kinds of remedies for assaults on these different kinds of freedom. Now, most advocates of CL aren't pacifists, but they don't want to see arguments settled at gunpoint. They unequivocally oppose aggressive violence. So they don't suppose that petty indignities warrant violent responses. At the same time, though, they recognize that it makes no sense to favor freedom as a general value while treating nonviolent assaults on people's freedom as trivial. So naturally, then they favor a range of nonviolent responses to such assaults, including public shaming or blacklisting, striking, protesting, withholding voluntary certifications, boycotting, and so forth. CL provides then a further reason to oppose Capitalism 3. Most people committed to CL find MUP very plausible, and thus they will be inclined to think of Capitalism 3 as a product to a large extent of Capitalism 2. That is, people wouldn't have the social privilege that enables them to exert nonviolent pressure on others without the kinds of market-distorting privileges that big government, big business partnership makes possible. But the understanding of freedom as a multidimensional value that can be subject to assaults, both violent and nonviolent, provides good reason to oppose Capitalism 3, even if, as is most unlikely, it were to occur in complete isolation from Capitalism 2. Capitalism 2 and Capitalism 3 are both inconsistent with free market principles. Capitalism 2 because it involves direct interference with market freedom, Capitalism 3 because it depends on such interference, both past and ongoing, and because it flies in the face of the general commitment to freedom that underlies support for market freedom in particular. Free market advocates should call what they oppose capitalism. This is a more radical claim. It's not just the case that they shouldn't use capitalism for the system they favor, they should actually use capitalism as a label for the system they oppose. Given the contradictory meanings of capitalism, perhaps sensible people just should avoid using it at all. But words are known by the company they keep. So while they certainly shouldn't use it as a tag for the system they favor, there are good reasons for advocates of free markets, especially those committed to comprehensive liberty, to CL, to use this word for what they oppose. Number one, to emphasize the specific undesirability of Capitalism 3. Labels like state capitalism and corporatism capture what's wrong with Capitalism 2, but they don't quite get at the problem with Capitalism 3. Even if, as seems plausible, rule by capitalists requires a political explanation, an explanation in terms of the independent misbehavior of politicians and of the manipulation of politicians by business leaders, it's worth objecting to rule by big business, to social dominance by big business, in addition to challenging business-government symbiosis. To the extent that those who own and lead big businesses are often labeled capitalists, identifying what proponents of freedom oppose as capitalism helps appropriately to highlight their critique of Capitalism 3. To differentiate proponents of freed markets from vulgar market enthusiasts. The capitalist banner is often waved enthusiastically by people who seem inclined to confuse support for freed markets with support for Capitalism 2 and Capitalism 3. Perhaps ignoring the reality or the problematic character of both, perhaps even celebrating Capitalism 3 as somehow appropriate in light of the purportedly admirable characters of business titans. Now, opposing capitalism, therefore, helps to ensure that advocates of freed markets are not confused with these vulgar proponents of freedom for the power elite. To emphasize that the freed market really is an unknown ideal. Given the frequency with which the contemporary economic order in Western societies is labeled capitalism by both its proponents and its critics, certainly in the media you constantly hear about the free market capitalist reality we now have, anyone who acknowledges the vast gap between ideals of freedom and an economic reality distorted by privilege and misshapen by past acts of violent dispossession will have good reason to oppose what is commonly called capitalism, to oppose it rather than embracing it. To challenge a conception of the market economy that treats capital as more fundamental than labor. So multiple factors of production, notably including labor, contribute to the operation of a market economy. To refer to such an economy as capitalist is to imply, incorrectly, that capital plays the most central role in a market economy, and that the capitalist, the absentee owner of investable wealth, is ultimately more important than the people who are the sources of labor. Advocates of freed markets should reject this inaccurate view. Labor matters. Here's a more radical proposal, more radical reason to target the word capitalism. It's to reclaim the word socialism for free market radicals, freed market radicals. Capitalism and socialism are characteristically seen as forming an oppositional pair. But it was precisely the socialist label that a radical proponent of freed markets, Benjamin Tucker, owned at the time when these terms were being passionately debated and defined in the 19th century. Tucker, for whatever it's worth, clearly saw no conflict between his intense commitment to freed markets and his membership of the First International, the international socialist body that Marx dominated. That's because he understood socialism as a matter of liberating workers from oppression by aristocrats and business executives, and he plausibly believed that ending the privileges conferred on economic elites by the state would be the most effective, the safest way of achieving this liberating goal. Opposing capitalism helps to underscore the important place of radicals like Tucker in the contemporary freedom movement's lineage, and to provide today's advocates of freedom with a persuasive rationale for capturing the socialist label from state socialists. Socialism names an end, not necessarily statist means to that end. This is especially appropriate because advocates of freedom believe that society, connected people cooperating freely and voluntarily, rather than the state, should be seen as the source of solutions to human problems. And thus they can reasonably be said to favor a kind of socialism, not as a kind of, but rather as an alternative to stateism. Embracing anti-capitalism underscores the fact that freed markets offer a way of achieving socialist goals, fostering the empowerment of workers and the wide dispersion of ownership of and control over the means of production using market means. Socialist ends, market means. To express solidarity with workers, if MUP is correct, the ability of big business, or capital, to maximize the satisfaction of its preferences more fully than workers are able to maximize the satisfaction of theirs, is a function of business-state symbiosis that is inconsistent with free market principles. And as a matter of support for CL, there is often further reason to side with workers when they're being pushed around. Even if they're being pushed around non-aggressively, being pushed around is bad. To the extent that the bosses workers oppose are often called capitalists, so that anti-capitalism seems like a natural tag for their opposition to these bosses, and to the extent that freed markets, by contrast with Capitalism 2 and Capitalism 3, would dramatically increase the opportunities for workers simultaneously to shape the contours of their own lives and to experience significantly greater prosperity and economic security, embracing, quote, anti-capitalism is a way of clearly signaling solidarity with workers. To identify with the legitimate concerns of the global anti-capitalist movement. Owning anti-capitalism is also a way, more broadly, of identifying with ordinary people around the world who express their opposition to imperialism, the increasing power in their lives of multinational corporations, and their own growing economic vulnerability, by naming their enemy as capitalism. That's the label they use. Now, perhaps some of them endorse inaccurate theoretical accounts of their circumstances, in accordance with which it really is a free market system, capitalism one, that should be understood as lying behind what they oppose. But for many of them, objecting to capitalism doesn't really mean opposing freed markets. It means using a convenient label provided by social critics who are prepared, as advocates of freedom too often, regrettably, embarrassingly or not, to stand with them in challenging the forces that seem bent on misshaping their lives and those of others. Advocates of freedom have a golden opportunity to build common ground with these people, agreeing with them about the wrongness of many of the circumstances they confront, while providing a freedom-based explanation of their circumstances and a freedom-based remedy for the attendant problems.